So, I want to open this video up with two facts about me. When I was a kid, my favorite vehicle make was Chevy, and my favorite color was red. Honestly, I wish I had some grand story or something to quantify this with, but I don't. My family never really drove Chevys, and I mean, do kids really put that much insight and thought into their favorite color? Even when watching my channel, you can tell I favor the bow tie given personal rankings and who I've covered. I'll still give flowers regardless of the make of the truck because, well, vehicle territorialism, especially when everything here is fiberglass, is stupid, but I'll give a little extra tier to the red trucks, and especially the red Chevys. There's been plenty across the sport's history, even today. But being an early 2000s kid, as I was, there was one in particular that caught my eye and appealed to my mushy little underdeveloped brain. A tall stance S10 from Michigan, with a husband and wife team. This is the story of the Destroyer. Let's get started. Before we get to red, we must start with blue. Hell, wait a while and we'll also cross off yellow. We're getting all the primary colors covered today, folks. Idaho's Larry Nakaya was more of a local hero running along the Northwest in the 1990s. After selling off his first truck, which would become the original Lone Wolf, he would build a new piece by 1996, even making it to Hawaii.
Did someone say Hawaii?
And getting some televised coverage during TNN's Motor Madness in Tacoma. God, I love this track so much. I want you to pay attention to this design here, as although it would run a short-lived updated S10 body, the truck would be sold in 1998, where Larry would work in local trades until passing away in 2021. The truck would be sold to a man named Dan Evans. Dan would get his toes in the water, helping operate the short-lived Eliminator ride truck, but this was a massive step up. Now, he was running his own operation. Dan would take one of the Blue Max bodies and give it a name swap, the Destroyer. See, here's what's wild, this isn't even the first Destroyer. This short clip of a truck called Destroyer from Monster Truck Throwdown is, yeah, according to Elliot Miller, this was indeed Dan Evans running on Lone Wolf, no not that one, this one. Ironic. According to Dan himself, this truck was very short-lived, as he would soon acquire the aforementioned Blue Max. The truck would run across the Michigan area and surrounding states through 2000, even getting his first televised appearance at the 2000 season opener with an impressive save. Fun fact too, this design was one of the first planned 1/43rd scale trucks Monster Jam had planned, or what they call rev treads. Looking at this photo here, you can see Survivor, Predator, and Nitro Machine, all of which got releases, but also the Blue Destroyer. However, plans for this would be scrapped, and we would have to wait before getting an airy variation Destroyer in diecast form. New Orleans would see for the first time the new Destroyer with the updated S10 and the red design the truck would become synonymous with. Couple of notes is even this early on, the moniker Airman Dan would be put on the windshield, a title he would carry throughout his career, while also too having his wife Lori as the crew chief. Really, aside from the Cretans, they were one of only a handful of married duos on the circuit at the time. Dan would finish his televised season strong with a great performance in the Silverdome, but would miss the cut for the first Monster Jam World Finals. One thing to note too, Dan's relationship with Monster Jam was different than that of other independents. Best comparison I can really say to modern times is probably Black Pearl, where, yes, he's an independent, but really seeing Dan outside of a Monster Jam event, especially after 2000, was rare unless you were living in Michigan. St. Louis would give us our first look at Dan in 2001 with a solid showing. Dan was known more of a freestyler than a racer. His truck didn't quite have the punch on the straights like Bounty Hunter or Gravedigger, but in freestyle where that didn't matter as much, he used every cubic inch to his advantage. A strong performing in Indianapolis, but some less than stellar ones in Houston and Minneapolis, plus rolling the truck twice in the season, including Mini and an untelevised Miami show, made the second half of the season rougher for Dan. Still, he made enough of a case being fired to the World Finals that season, where he would surprise many folks making the semifinals before losing out to Tom Meents. However, his run would be cut from the broadcast in full, being truncated, like another truck we saw the following year, and what we talked about, Bulldozer. 2002, and it would open with a strong freestyle in Houston, and a controversial loss at Gravedigger in St. Louis. However, St. Louis would feature a final key element in the Destroyer lore, throwing the truck in reverse. Dan wasn't the first to do this, as people like Mike Vauders and Lyle Hancock had peppered into their freestyles at that point, but this is something that Dan would be synonymous with. And sure, in 2025, when drivers can do reverse moonwalk sidewalls, this seems quaint, but back then, this was enough to take a strong lead, and Dan would use this to his benefit often. Dan would get a surprise pole position in Houston at the second show, where his opponent would do nothing of note. And again, another strong freestyle and reverse move. By this time as well, the team would have a ride truck that would tour either with or without the race truck in tow over the next few seasons. Pontiac would feature his strongest freestyle to date with a stellar performance, and another one in Minneapolis helped give him by far his most momentum heading into the World Finals.
We're a little disappointed that we didn't make it to Vegas.
Is this a byproduct of a cow? Because this is bullshit. Yeah, Dan would not make it to the World Finals not only this year, but the next 2 years as well, following in what I feel like is a huge snub. Sure, with 16 trucks, some cuts have to be made, but man, you could have been tossed a bone at least once. 2003 will be relatively short, as again, no airing on Speed and no Las Vegas meant no destroyer of any kind, sans a few clips from Crash Madness, including what I believe is the first documented rollover from a reverse move in Indianapolis. 2004, however, would be a big year despite my burying of the lead. See, by this time, Hot Wheels was starting to do designs for teams to coincide with merch releases, and Houston 2004 would basically become a showcase as Bounty Hunter, Scarlet Bandit, Devastator, Bad News, and of course Destroyer would all unveil new looks. The design wasn't too different, at least not as different as it's going to get later, but still added some flash to the truck. Dan had some strong runs too, especially in Houston, Orlando, and Pontiac. Plus now we finally get merchandise including diecast and Wendy's toys. I, of course, had to make the noble sacrifice of eating a lot of kids' meals to get it. The truck would once again be denied a World Finals appearance, but 2005 would begin a changing of the tide, as that year would begin a 5-year continuous streak of World Finals appearances. The team would run an inverse scheme for solely 2005, and would begin a truck of Southeast shows including Atlanta and Orlando, then over to Minneapolis and St. Louis, and rounding out in Jacksonville, making this some of the most coverage he had to date. Plus, also again Pontiac, which in my opinion is one of the most bizarre cut shows from Monster Jam broadcast. Dan would, as stated earlier, make the World Finals and debut a new yellow scheme, where he would fall to Medusa, but in a game of one-upsmanship with Mike Vaughters would do a combo reverse move, securing him a finish of 5th on the muddy track. Dan would continue to run the yellow scheme through the summer stretch before bringing back the 2004 scheme, which would run for the next 2 seasons, retiring both the 05 designs, having never been ran again following this year. Dan, despite normally having some good luck in Pontiac, would have a subpar performance at the final Monster Jam in the Silverdome, but would show some consistent runs in Orlando and Tampa, making his presence known further in the Southeast. His son Derek, who would crew, actually started to drive around this time, not only Power Destroyer, but also the short-lived Spellcaster, and then would drive Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles next year touring Brainy Brown and Gravedigger, making him one of the first real second-generation drivers of monster trucks. Dan would fill in for Lupe Souza in Detroit, and he did a good job with the new piece. Perhaps Dan figured if these PEIs are so popular, they may serve him well. More on that later. The World Finals would come, and he would fall in round 1 to another longtime veteran, Alan Pizzo, and would finish with a 10th place after nosing the truck over hard in freestyle. The truck was over 10 years old at this point, and the sport was evolving fast. The truck didn't really seem to keep up with the newer tech. So, heading into the winter of 2007, Dan would do a retirement tour for the original truck, with a brand new in the works to debut that summer. Let's do a quick sidetrack. So, by this time, Monster Jam's international division was really picking up, and Dan, alongside Charlie Pauken, Chad Fortune, and John Seesock, was really instrumental in this process. He would first drive Batman, but his 2 most notable rides were the European exclusive Jetix truck, which would then be converted to Disney XD after the network rebranded. Dan would drive these 2 trucks for 7 years total, being one of the longest tenured international drivers. Not bad for someone with a dream from Michigan, but let's get back stateside with Destroyer. We would only see Dan twice on Speed in the lead-up with Orlando, including running with his son Derek in Jacksonville where he secured 26 in freestyle. Ironically, in Las Vegas, he would best the Turtle, but with Derek's touring mate Randy Brown behind the wheel, rolling the truck over. Then would follow the Lindsey Winkin Iron Outlaw. Freestyle, however, Dan would send the truck into reverse, snap a tire, and roll the truck end over end in what would be his final freestyle with the original chassis. For the second edition of Monster on Main Street, Dan would debut the all-new Destroyer, and whoa! I don't know if I would be able to do a top 10 most dramatic changes in monster truck history, but this would be up there. Where to start? Well, really, aside from the logo carrying over and having 4 tires, everything is different. Firstly, it's a PEI, which again, was the reliable standard at the time. Secondly, Dan would lean into the Navy theme with a wild new paint, and oh yeah, it's a Ford. Sacrilege. I do love the design, actually, real talk. This hasn't been confirmed, but it seems like it was possible Dan would have stuck with the original body, as in the Monster Jam video game, the third video game appearance for Destroyer, it would feature the new design but on the Chevy S10. Also carry over into Urban Assault, then be placed on the appropriate body for its final video game appearance in Monster Jam Path of Destruction. Our first look at the revamped Destroyer on TV would be in Atlanta, which marked my sole time seeing the truck in person. And the new piece would perform well. You could definitely tell this is a more stable truck versus the original with how much the competition was advancing. Orlando and Jacksonville especially showed how much he was adapting to the new piece, and he would make the World Finals, although for someone who would have at least strong showings, this would not be the case, as a bad bounce would give him his first rollover in the World Finals and his lowest score in World Finals history with a 5. By this time, the relative flow was pretty similar. Sans some local events, Dan would put Destroyer up in the shop while he ran Europe, securing wins across the continent. Derek's career would come to an end as he would only run very one-off after the end of 2007. We would only see Dan twice in 2009, with his best performance coming from Jacksonville, but he was running across the southeast as he normally does. But this trip to Vegas would mark the final one not only for him but also Destroyer. Honestly, for the next couple of years, Dan and Destroyer became rare to see on TV. He was still competing, sure, but compared to the likes of drivers like Jeremy Slivko and John Zimmer, Dan and Destroyer weren't really getting as much of the spotlight. He was still prominent in Europe, but not as much domestically. And perhaps Dan sensed this too, as he would sell Destroyer in the closing months of 2011, and he would debut the brand new Team Hot Wheels truck. Who would the truck be sold to? Roger Stidell of Washington. Roger was best known at times as the co-driver of Jeff Boehner's Captain USA, and he would begin campaigning Destroyer across the Pacific Northwest into Canada. Although this wouldn't lead to televised exposure, the truck would compete with Monster Jam and also more independent promoters, most prominently being the annual show for Monster Jam Tacoma. The truck would also tour frequently with Tony Canedo, who purchased Playing for Keeps after the passing of another Michigan native, Jesse Berge, in 2008. 2013 would bring about a new trophy truck body, something you saw pretty commonly across this time, primarily trucks like Bigfoot, Ballistic, and Gunslinger. This would end up being the final Destroyer scheme, as the truck would run for the next 3 seasons, even going international, before suddenly stopping all touring in 2016 and laying dormant ever since. Why? Well, it's never been confirmed, so take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt, but apparently, due to a financial falling out between Roger and Tony, Destroyer has been held as collateral ever since. What about Dan? Well, he would run Team Hot Wheels through 2012, including during the Path of Destruction tour. But when Scott Buteau took the reins, Dan would drive the next 2 seasons with Blue Thunder, then move to more working with international developments behind the scenes for FELD, occasionally doing some displays, but has not driven since 2015, enjoying the retirement life. For as sour as the truck's name ended, at least for Dan, it seems like from all accounts he just simply felt like it was the right time to step away and leave his legacy where it was. So, that's where the story ends, right? Well, not entirely. See, of course Dan and Lori were the main crew, but there were other crew members, and one of them would bring his young son to shows, and get him up close with the truck at a young age. This would spark a lifelong passion to one day get behind the wheel. That kid's name? Tim Hall Jr. Yeah, the guy's been tearing up every weekend with Jurassic Attack, got started by seeing his pops turn wrenches on Destroyer. And while the odds of Team Throttle buying the name are slim, it is nice to see that the same big air and reckless abandon Dan through every weekend is still spiritually being carried on in a modern format. Where does this leave the story? Honestly, I don't know. It sounds like there's no real plans for Destroyer to return, and with both Dan and Derek very much enjoying the retirement life and Tim piloting the dyno, it may stay that way. But looking back in the era before everyone was doing moonwalks, a truck going backwards over a bus seems cute. I want y'all to put yourselves in the mindset of someone from the early 2000s. This was massive. I think reflecting on this, it's in line with what I appreciate the most as a fan. the weekend warriors going up and down the road, giving it all out of their pocket. Honestly, this sort of small one-team truck operation competing in big stadiums is basically all but gone. And look, this isn't me complaining about the teams we see nowadays, but there's something I do miss about these smaller teams still being able to put up numbers even if they don't have the deepest pockets. Their stories deserve to be told all the same, and I hope in some small part this adds to it. Dan and his family had a dream and got to travel the globe entertaining fans across the world. Not bad for someone starting from a limo company in Michigan. But anyways, I've gone off track, and I'll see you all next time.